waiting. So we have a large crowd already, 41 people right on the dot. So let's break out in these little breakout rooms that we traditionally do of 5 people. David, cheers to you, sir. I'll open up as well. So let's kick off this happy hour with a little bit of networking and breakout rooms of groups of 5. We'll do it for the next 15 minutes or so until 5:45, and then we'll reconvene with some announcements, and then we can let Warren begin his presentation. So I'll see you guys out there.
All right, folks, everybody else is about to join us soon. Hi, Warren. It's great to see you.
Hey, how are you?
Doing well. How are you doing?
Great. Can you hear me okay?
Oh, yeah, it's perfect. And I am about to make you a co-host. And
oh, no.
Oh, yeah, put
Too
you
much
in the
responsibility.
spotlight too.
Hey, Beryl. It's Alexandra.
Hi there. How are you doing?
I'm doing terrific. It's good to see you.
It's so great to see you. We definitely need to catch up after this meeting, I'd say.
We should next week. I would really love that. I have a lot of positive momentum I want to share with you.
Ooh, I always love hearing that. Here we go, and I think we have Juan back too. Hey, Juan. Welcome back to the main room, everybody.
Thank you, guys. Thank you all. I see Warren is online. He's joining us. So we'll just to fill you guys in a little bit, we're really excited for this afternoon's happy hour with Warren Lasher from ERCOT. We're going to spend the next 15 minutes or so just going through some announcements from Solar Austin. So I'll ask everyone to mute the mics since we have 51 people on the call and we are expecting a larger audience to fill in the house. Feel free to also share your LinkedIn information. This is also an opportunity to network and get to know our community. Feel free to use the chat, message each other privately. But we're also going to go through some house rules before the presentation. Now, as mentioned, welcome to the happy hour. So this is, we're doing these virtually in accordance with COVID guidelines, et cetera, and hope to perhaps do them in person someday soon. But in the meantime, just so you guys can understand who we are a little bit better, this is our team. If you're not familiar, we are a volunteer-run organization with Beryl being our paid employee. And until recently, we just hired our first executive director, Tatiana Cannon. It's a pleasure for her to help us lead all of our different initiatives. She's extremely well educated, a laughter and a little bubble of joy that comes around and helps us be a little bit more pragmatic as an organization, keeping everything in place as well as pushing our initiatives in equity, sustainability, and greater connection with the community. So if you have any sort of ideas or any comments about how we could do a better job to stay close to the community, she's your woman to talk to. She helps guide kind of all our different subcommittees and puts them together. So feel free to shoot her an email, Tatiana, that's with 2 N's, Cannon with 2 N's, at solaraustin.org. So if you guys aren't familiar, we are almost a 20-year-old organization, founded in 2002 as a 501c3 as a way to help push pro-solar legislation and education and overall access to solar technologies across Central Texas. So we are a 501c3. Also have a 501c4 that can do a little bit of the lobbying effort. But now we've kind of entered this second era of Solar Austin, especially with Tatiana joining on board. We are divided into 5 different subcommittees. Right now we are in the events committee, doing a little bit of outreach with the community, working a little bit to tie all the different ends of the industry together and put them in a central place for you guys to access them. We also are involved in advocating for pro-solar policy or climate change policy with different allies, whether it's Citizens Climate Lobby or Sierra Club, or Public Citizen as well. That we were involved in that. Our education committee is also very active with high schoolers, middle schoolers, and universities as well. Then tying with universities is the Pathways program, which is one of our biggest initiatives, almost 2 years old, in which we are helping place high school students and university students of minority groups, so whether they're women or people of color, into internships in the renewable energy industry. And then lastly, we're doing our community installations. This is when we're partnering up with other resources in Austin to create these community resiliency centers. Speak a little bit more about that. You know, this is going to be our next installation happening in the next few months. We see the shining faces of our board members, Kenneth, Stan, and Rich, with the solar panels that we got donated. We had the whole system donated to put them up on a nonprofit called the Children's Haven. That's located right on Chacon Street by MLK. And it's been one of the longest standing nonprofits in Austin that helps disadvantaged communities just reach a little bit of a stable ground as they work a little bit closer to get their footing straight and be part of our society. So this is a great labor of love as it comes with their many years of community involvement as we work together to install solar and storage in their facility. So this installation will happen in the next 3 or 4 weeks. Stay tuned so that we can send you a little bit note, and that way you can also walk up to it, ask any questions, feel the solar panels, touch it, and get a feel for what it is to install solar. It's relatively an easy process. As part of our education committee, I think right now we are working with the Chamber of Commerce in Flugerville to do what's called Real World Flugerville. This is when we have a virtual booth, and we recorded a video of different solar energy professionals to showcase students what it's like to be in the industry. So this is a virtual career fair of sorts that the city of Pflugerville's Chamber of Commerce has put on for their students. A little more about Pathways. I'll let Beryl, who's our program manager, kind of help us and help you understand what it is that we're doing with our Pathways to Clean Energy career.
Thanks, Juan. The Pathways to Clean Energy Careers program was launched about 1.5 years ago, thanks to this grant from the city of Austin. And this program has taken many shapes over the last 1.5 years, but its main goal is to be able to facilitate these more equitable pathways for women students and students of color to be able to engage with clean energy and really build careers in this industry. These internships are not just a one-off thing. What this program does, it's really looking at the whole person by providing them mentorship opportunities, by incorporating them in these workshops that talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, and how to navigate cultural differences in the workplace. And also, we also provide a lot of professional development resources for these students, whether it be resume review or interview prep workshops before they even step foot in the office, or talking about where to go after they get this internship, what next, how to build a clean energy career. This program is very near and dear to my heart, and one of the aspects that we're really hoping to develop more this next year and this next semester especially is the mentorship program. Juan, if you could possibly go to the next slide. Mentorship, formal mentorship opportunities are very, very hard to come by in the clean energy industry for some reason, especially for those at entry-level positions. And so we're trying to bridge that gap between students who really want to learn about the industry and those who have the knowledge. If for anyone out there who would like to get involved with this program and might not have the capacity to bring on an intern, this is a really great way to do that. What we're really looking for is just someone who has the time to participate, to be able to not only participate in the training workshops, but also really build a relationship with these young students. You can find more information on Solar Austin's website, and I'll be dropping that link actually in the chat box in just a moment. Or feel free to email me at info@solaraustin.org. Thank you so much, Juan. Back to you.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a relatively informal mentorship that it's just providing a little bit of an opportunity for students to ask questions, and maybe it's mid-career professionals that want to hear about different parts of the industry. Like if you're in installation and want to get into manufacturing, et cetera. We really hope to use our network and use our community to help fuel this need for people to progress in their careers in the solar sector. We're also right now participating in what we call, what the Gannett Foundation calls the Mighty Cause fundraiser. So we're lucky to be halfway through the second week almost, and almost halfway through to our goal of raising $25,000. Now, this opportunity only happens once a year. Last year, we were one of the first nationally ranked nonprofits that won one of their bonus contests, and as a result of that, we got bonus money for our Pathways program. So right now we have 3 weeks left to continue to raise our goal of $25,000, and it would be great if you could take a moment, if you haven't done so already, to scan the QR code and donate $1, maybe $2. Any bit helps, you know, as we reach this goal, and then that way we can expand the pathways, expand mentorship, expand our education resources as well. And if you've done so already, we're very grateful for you helping us reach our goal so far. It's great imaginable progress, and we couldn't do it alone. So appreciate you all for that. Some other donors that have been very generous with us, starting locally, has been FTC Solar. You know, they're a tracker and software manufacturer based here out of Austin, Texas, and also Recurrent Energy, a developer, Mayfield, Yada. There's Orsted and Downtown Austin City Alliance and Freedom Solar Power. Without these guys, as well as PowerFin and Z Prime and Hush and Blackwell and HEB and these Mubby Monkeys, like, we wouldn't really be here. It's important to also highlight Piper Maddox as CD Green Tech, Sunpro, and Lighthouse Solar, as well as Greenbelt Solar, Harris Energy Solutions, Greenhawk Business Services, Greener by Design, the Deere Group, and Clean Power Marketing. All of these sponsors have their links on their websites where you can learn more, whether they're involved in accounting or marketing or recruitment if you're looking for a job, or solar design. These are services available to you. And they're also supporting Solar Austin. Another piece of another QR code for you to scan. This one is so we can get a little bit closer. We care a lot as a board and as an organization about what you think, what your opinions are, what you think that could benefit your use of your time with us through these happy hours or through other events. So please scan this QR code and take 5 minutes sometime to complete our survey. Also, Daryl just dropped the link on the chat. With this survey, you can respond whether or not you believe that our happy hours are beneficial, what type of speakers you want to have, if the timing is not convenient, if you want to have them in person and not. Like, it's important for us to hear from you what it is that you think we could be doing better as an organization for you. Also, you get a chance of winning a Solar Austin shirt. We'll be doing this until August, and so it's pretty nice that perhaps you can get a nice shirt with a pretty cool sun logo on the back of it. So that would be a nice perk. But also, speaking of perks, it's going to be a pleasure to have Warren speak with us. This is, I think, maybe the second or third year in which we've had the privilege of getting a little bit of insight from ERCOT. You know, Warren is a numbers guy. Warren focuses more on on the planning and the forecasting of the future of ERCOT. He's one of the most hip, I believe that someone called them, I think in our breakout room. He said that he was probably the most hip senior official at ERCOT. So it's a pleasure to have him join us and talk to us a little bit more about the planning that is happening for them to balance out our increasing need for more energy in Texas. We want to also be conscientious of all the different topics that have been brought up of ERCOT in the media, ERCOT in the past. We don't necessarily want to have this be the space for that. We want to speak more about the future and we want to see what are the solutions and what are the tools that they're implementing with technology to keep up with our growing energy demand. As such, then we ask any questions to be on the chat box. And that way later, when we have 15 or 20 minutes after the presentation, we can group them together and we can let Warren continue the spotlight and answer any sort of questions from the community. Without further ado, Warren, I'll pass on the mic to you, but thank you so much. But it's a pleasure.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much. It really is a pleasure for me to be here. Can you hear me okay?
Excellent, crystal
Okay,
clear.
good. Yeah. And so I've got to say, I don't think I've ever been called hip before, but I'm gonna carry that with me for quite some time. I'm actually hip. So I don't see my slides right at the moment. Are they?
So let me share my.
I'm one of those guys can't do anything without my slides. Well, it's not really true, but okay. Yeah, so to start off, a couple things. First of all, I'm going to be talking about some of the challenges that we face going forward from a grid perspective, and kind of when I talk about some things from the grid perspective, I'm going to towards the end, I'm going to try to wrap this back to more the consumer level and some of the consumer challenges, and really some of the challenges that are coming associated with some of the consumer options that are now available. And I also am going to do my best to leave as much time as I can for questions, because, you know, what I really want to do here is to be able to share some of the where ERCOT is right now, but really provide it in answer to kind of what you're interested in. So I'm going to do my best to I'll leave time for questions at the very end. So if you go to the next slide, I almost always start off with this particular slide looking at the ERCOT grid. And what I mean by a grid, an interconnection, in each of the 3 interconnections that you see here, there's one in Texas, and then there's one that covers almost all of the eastern United States and parts of Canada, and one that covers most of the western United States and parts of Canada. In these areas, there are transmission lines. So now these are high voltage lines. In ERCOT, they are 69,000 volts, 138,000 volts, and 345,000 volts, 345 kilovolts. So these transmission lines are all just connected together. And what they do is they connect power plants, these plants that generate electricity. They connect all of these power plants in the ERCOT region. It's over 700 generation units. They connect them to consumers. Every consumer across most of the state of Texas is connected by these transmission lines that connect the power plants to the consumers. And so, you know, all the way down to the outlets that you have in your house or in your store or your church or the factory, et cetera. Now, the transmission circuits are these high voltage circuits that move the power from the power plants across this almost spider web of transmission circuits, and the power flows from all of these units to all the consumers just based on the laws of physics. So there's no controlling the actual flow of power down to what we call the distribution system. And the distribution system is everything below 69,000 volts. So really what happens is the power flows into a substation, and then it flows down to lower voltage levels, and it's actually sent out on what we call distribution feeders out to the actual customers. So there's really 2 different systems that are going on here. There's the transmission system, which moves power across the state. And then there's the distribution system that moves power from a substation right down to the consumer level, from the nearest substation to the consumer level. And I will tell you a couple things. Historically, those 2 systems don't really talk to each other that much. Either the actual operations of them, you know, so the actual control mechanisms don't really communicate. And in addition, the people that run the distribution system don't really talk too much to the people that run the transmission systems. This is something that we'll talk about later on. But in the past, that was okay, because power would move from the power plants down to these distribution substations, and then it would just get distributed out. But now, as we see more and more consumer options, that all is beginning to change. And like I said, we'll talk more about that in a little bit. So what you'll see here in particular is that the state of Texas has its own interconnection. And there's very limited capability to move power in or out of that interconnection. And the reason for that really is, to some extent, historical. To some extent, it's because of some physical limitations that have arisen over time. But this is where we are today. We have 4 what we call direct current ties. And so these are not unlike those pneumatic tubes at the bank where you take your money and you put it in the tube and it goes into the bank. These are devices where it actually takes AC, alternating current power, off of the interconnection and converts it into direct current power, and then converts it back into alternating current power and pushes that onto the other side. And so what that does is it allows for a controlled process where you can move power from one grid to the other. But in particular, I want to highlight, it's just about 1,200 megawatts of capacity, and our peak demand from 2 years ago was 74,000 megawatts of demand from consumers. So that's, you can see it's very limited capability to move power in or out. And that really leads to the consideration of the energy that is used here in the ERCOT region in Texas has to be produced in the ERCOT region, because we can't move that power in from a different region. Okay, so let's go on to the next slide. So when we start talking about the fact that we are a small interconnection and we have to generate all of that power within our own interconnection, the question becomes, will we have enough resources to serve the peak demands? And ERCOT produces 2 different reports that kind of look at this from the perspective of looking out long-term over the next 10 summers, and then looking out for the next season. Do we expect to have enough operating reserves, or what we call reserve margin, in order to serve that peak customer demand? And the reserve margin is really just, if you look at what your expected peak demand is, meaning the amount of power that's going to get used by consumers in that hottest day of the summer, you look at that demand and you look at the amount of capacity you have above that demand, and then you look at that in terms of a percentage of the actual demand from consumers. So, if you had, just as an example, if you had 100,000 megawatts was your expected peak demand, and you had 10,000 megawatts of reserves, 10,000 is 10% of 100,000. So you would say you had a reserve margin of 10%. Oh, no, wait, go back one. I had another thought that I hadn't quite gotten to yet. Yeah, okay, we'll go on. You're
Are you sure?
yeah, please go on. I'm sure I'll think of it again. Go on to the next slide. Okay. So if we look back in history, about 3 years ago, there was a significant retirement of coal resources here in the ERCOT region. So about 5,000 megawatts of coal resources. Now, most of these resources were 50 or so years old. They had basically been used through their expected lifespan. They were retired. And that led to a situation where we had historically low reserve margins going into the summer of 2019. And the reserve margin going into the summer of 2019 was actually 8.6%. Now, since that time, we have seen a significant growth in resources on the grid, in particular, wind resources and solar resources. And that has led to, going into this summer, we have a reserve margin of 15.7%. So almost double the reserve margin that we had 2 years ago. And as you can see here, the latest capacity demand reserves report, which is this long-term report, looks out over 10 years. The latest report shows those numbers are going to increase significantly up into 28%, 35%, et cetera. So what is really driving this is the interest in building solar resources on the grid. And I've got a chart in just a minute that we're going to look at solar resources. But before we do that, I want to highlight the fact that, and this is going to be something that we're going to talk about over the next few slides, I want to highlight the fact that when we count what we call variable resources like wind and solar resources, when we count those resources in our reserve margin study reports, we have to be careful to account for the fact that some of those resources won't be producing at full output. And this is particularly important for wind resources because some days it's windy and some days it's not windy. And so the question becomes, well, how much of the wind do we count in these reports? There's lots of different ways to do this. We used to have a different methodology, which we changed about 4 years ago. And the current methodology that we have is we look at the output of these resources. So now this is particularly wind and solar resources. We look at the output of these wind resources during the top 20 demand hours. So the hours in which customer demand is at its maximum, the top 20 demand hours of the year, looking back over several years, and then we take an average of that. So what we're really saying is we're going to take the average of how much the wind and the solar was producing during those hours in which consumer demand was at its peak. So that's the calculation that we do. And I'm going to return to that. I've got a whole bunch of charts here that we're going to be returning to that. But I want you to note, so the number for wind, we've got a couple different regions, but when we look back over history, the number that we use for wind is 25% across all the different regions. We have 3 different regions that we kind of split wind into. And the real reason we split wind into different regions is because along the coast, late in the afternoon on summers, you tend to get a breeze off the coast back onto the shore. And so we see a lot more output from wind resources that are right down along the coast in those summer hours. And that's exactly when consumer demand is at its maximum, is summer afternoons when it's really hot, especially when it's hot in Houston and it's hot in Dallas. So we account for the coastal region different from the rest. And then also the panhandle region, we've got some wind resources that go all the way up to Amarillo. Some of those resources show different output during those hot late summer afternoons. So wind we count for 25%. Now solar, on the other hand, when we hit those peak conditions, it's usually around 5 p.m. And we're getting good output from our solar resources, particularly because when it's hot in Dallas and it's hot in Houston, typically it's pretty sunny, like today. And so typically the solar resources are performing very well, and we are currently counting 80% of the solar resources, 80% of the total solar capacity. We're counting that in these reports. But the first message I want to kind of share with you is from a grid perspective. We had historically low reserve margins just 2 years ago, and there was significant concern, but a lot of that has been alleviated going forward primarily because of the development of solar. So the reserve margin today at 15.7%, and then the reserve margin going forward looks to be very robust. Another thing I would like to highlight, though, is these numbers are based on information and schedules that we've been provided by resource developers themselves. So there's a significant amount of this capacity that is speculative today because the resource developers are planning to build these in the future. In order to get into this report at all, they have to have a signed contract with a transmission service provider in order to take transmission level service. So there's a certain amount of work that has to be done before we say, okay, this is likely enough that we're going to include it in our resource adequacy reports. But there's nothing to say that a project that's here could potentially be delayed or even canceled. And as a matter of fact, just in the last 2 or 3 months, we've seen about 2,000 megawatts of solar capacity get delayed by at least a year. So that is something that is out there that we are tracking. So if you go to the next slide, I waited until you were taking a drink so that I could catch you. If you go, right here. So this is a chart that shows development of solar resources on the transmission system. So this does not count solar that's on rooftops in neighborhoods, et cetera. On the transmission system, connected to the transmission system. And let me explain what the different colors mean. The blue at the bottom of the chart represents facilities that are operational today and what we would call commercially operational. So they've met all of their operating tests with ERCOT to be completely a part of the market. So that's the blue. The light blue above that, those are projects that have synchronized to the grid and they've started putting energy to the grid, but they have not yet passed all of these operational tests that are associated with commercial operations. The purple bar above that, those are projects that have those signed contracts for transmission service. But in addition to that, they've put down collateral in order to get transmission improvements built. So those really have some skin in the game at this point. And then the green bars above that represent projects that have that transmission contract, but they haven't put down collateral. And so important to note, when we look at these resource adequacy reports, it includes all 4 of these colors, but we break them out separately so that we can kind of see which ones are, more obviously the ones that are operational today are, in the ground. The purple bars are very likely to get completed. The green bars, maybe not quite so much, but you can see the significant growth of solar in the past year and then the next few years going forward. So the next slide, just as a point of interest, the next slide shows very similar colors, but now this is for utility scale batteries on the grid. And so this is a new technology that is of particular interest to developers. And some of these battery facilities are getting built right at the location of a solar array, so a set of solar panels out on the grid or a wind farm. And some of these are just being built, near a substation to provide energy services on the grid. And again, the colors mean the same things. You can see the numbers are smaller, but the shape looks very familiar. And if you went back about 2 or 3 years, this is kind of the shape and the numbers that you would have seen for solar on the grid. So really, just in the last 2 years or so, the interest in solar has really taken off, and the interest in batteries seems to be a little bit behind. Just to prove my hipness, I've got to kind of get my credibility as a hipster back. About 3 months ago, I took a ride out to a battery facility that's being built out in Andice, just to see how they were doing. And my hipsterness comes from the fact that I rode my motorcycle out there. So I rode my motorcycle out to see the battery facility out in Andice that is under development. It's a 100 megawatt battery facility. It's right along the road. It's right along 183. It doesn't look very distinctive. It looks almost like a warehouse with a large transformer next to it. And you might think, well, why does a warehouse need that large of a transformer? But these facilities really are going to bring significant change to the grid. And we'll be talking a little bit more about that. One thing I did want to highlight on this chart here, you can see there is actually an extra color. You've got your kind of your teal, you got your light blue, you've got your purple, and then you've got your green, and then you've got a dark blue above the green. And the dark blue represents batteries that are being built on the distribution system. So remember I said we got transmission moves the power to the distribution network, and then the distribution network, it takes that power and distributes that out to the actual customers. Well, now we've got some batteries, and that is a growing component of the system. We've got these batteries that want to connect to the distribution network, but they want to participate in the energy market just as though they were put onto the transmission system. So this is a little part of that change that we're seeing on the grid. We're going to see going forward. So if we look at the next slide, this gets back to these resource adequacy reports. And this is specifically looking at our study, looking at the summer season. So this is the season that we're now in. We issued this in May. So this is the summer season. And what we do in these short-term seasonal assessments is we look at our expected customer demand. We look at the amount of resources that we expect to have. And again, we're counting wind and solar the same way as I was talking about before. We look at our resources expected, our expected peak demand. And then we have a couple different scenarios that we look at to to kind of get an indication of what we expect it to be like in the control room when we hit that peak day. And so real briefly, obviously there are 4 scenarios here. On the left-hand side, that's what we expect the peak day to be. We expect a peak customer demand of over 77,000. Now, if those of you that were paying attention will remember, I think I said the peak demand record for the ERCOT region was 74,380 or something like that. So this would be a significant growth above that, driven by all the people that are moving to Texas, driven by the growing economy, et cetera. But on any given day, then there's a certain number of power plants that are offline. It's almost like if you had a fleet of trucks, you would expect on any given day, some of those trucks would be down for maintenance, and that will have a flat tire or a broken crankshaft, or something would be wrong, and they'd be obviously the fleet managers would be trying to get them fixed as quickly as possible and get them back out there. But some of those units would be down for some amount of what we would call a forced outage, but that would really be a unplanned, just something broke. And so typically on a hot summer day, we see about 3,600 megawatts of units that are on outage. And that would put us with having about 6,000 megawatts of reserves. So again, this is significantly better than what I would have shown you if we had been talking 2 years ago. So then the other scenarios here, well, the second scenario is, what if we have really high generation outages? So it just happens to be a day when there's a lot of units that are on outage. And so that kind of gives that. And again, almost 3,500 megawatts of reserves. The next scenario there says, well, okay, 2011 was really hot. Those of you that were in Austin back in 2011, it was really hot. What if we had another 2011 type summer? What would that peak day look like? And that peak day would have a peak demand of almost 80,000 over 80,000 megawatts of peak demand. That would be a significant amount of demand. And again, you would see reserves of about 3,100 megawatts. So in each of those 3 scenarios, we would have enough generation capacity that we would not have to enter any sort of emergency operations, et cetera. Now, the last scenario then is saying, well, what if we had very low wind output? So we have 31,000 megawatts of wind on the system. We count 25% of that. Okay. So that's, if you do the math, that's somewhere less, just shy of 8,000 megawatts that we're counting on a peak summer day. Now, I will tell you, there was a day in early June around 1 o'clock in the afternoon where there was 180 megawatts of wind being generated. So that's a significant amount of variability. And so going forward, one of the challenges that we face on the grid is taking into account that amount of variability when, as you can see, just from here, these 4 scenarios, obviously the 4th scenario is the one where grid operations would be significantly stressed. So next slide. If I had had this conversation with you back in November, I would have been showing similar scenarios for the winter season, and I would have based my extreme demand off of February 2011, which was the most extreme winter event we've had in recent memory. Obviously, February 2021 was more extreme. And so going forward, we are starting to incorporate more extreme scenarios into this SARA report. And that will be something that we have already implemented for this summer, but we will hope to improve as we go forward, looking into obviously the winter season and then going into future seasons. So that's something that we are putting a lot of effort into right now. The challenge is building credible scenarios based off of extreme conditions that maybe you haven't even seen before. So how do you build scenarios off of things that are more extreme than you've seen in recent history? So that's just a challenge. So I would like to spend the next few slides kind of really focusing in on the variability of wind and the variability of solar. So if you go to the next chart, this chart, for the next few charts, the wind, whatever the wind data is going to be in green, and the yellow is going to represent solar data. And I talked about the amount that we count wind and the amount that we count solar in our resource adequacy reports. But this chart is designed to really focus in on this year in ERCOT. And what I want to focus in on is the solid green line at the top of the chart represents the total amount of capacity of wind on the system. And you can see here in 2021, we are just crossing late in 2021, we're just crossing the 30,000 megawatts. I said we've got about 31,000 megawatts of wind today. The dotted green line below that then is the amount of wind we count in our reports. So that's that 25%. So we're getting up to about 8,000 megawatts, somewhere around there in the 21 timeframe. Okay. Now the solid yellow line represents the development of solar. And you can see how the development of solar is really taking off. And again, obviously this is counting the future units as we talked about before. The solid yellow line is the total amount capacity of solar. And the dotted yellow line then is the amount of solar we count in the resource adequacy reports. Another way to say that is the amount of solar we expect to have on the grid during those peak customer demand hours, the amount of solar we are counting on in order to serve customer demand. And what you can see is in 2021, the dotted yellow line crosses the dotted green line. That's what I really want to highlight. This is the year where we're going to be counting on more solar than we are counting on wind. And that's what I really want to focus in on for the next few slides. If you go back about 2 years, like I said, wind is very variable. There would have been a couple days where there was more solar than wind on the grid. Last summer, it was a little more frequent. Next summer, almost every day, there will be a significantly more amount of solar on the grid than wind, especially in that peak customer demand hour. So if you go to the next slide, this is where it gets a little bit complicated, but hopefully I've set everyone up to kind of understand what's going on here. So I talked about the fact that when we determine how much to count these resources on the grid, we look at the top 20 customer demand hours and we look back over the last few years. And so with solar, we're looking back 3 years. With wind, we've got more experience, so we can look back over more years. But it's those top 20 demand hours that we average. And so you might say, okay, well, if you're averaging a bunch of hours, there must be some hours that are more than the average, 80% for solar, and some hours that are less than the average. And that's what this chart here shows. It shows the spread of those 20 hours over the last 3 or more years. And so what you can see is the solar ranges from about 50% output to about 90% output. And the average then is 80%. And the wind in green again ranges from about 45% down to about 5%. And the average comes out to about 25%. So that just gives you a better idea of what that spread is. It means that there are some peak customer demand hours where we're getting about 5% of the wind. And there are some peak customer demand hours where we're only getting about 50% of the solar. On the flip side, there's some hours where we're getting 45% of the wind and 90% of the solar. Okay, so that explains that chart. Go to the next chart. Okay, so this chart here, it's the exact same data, but the blue line now is I've added in the expected output if we had a set, let's say 20 gas units. And it shows that the gas units, you're not always going to have all those gas units online, but you're often going to have probably more than about 85% of that capacity. But what I really want to highlight is that it's a narrower band. The variability of solar and the variability of wind, although solar is higher than wind because it's more coincident with peak demand, there's just a bigger spread in the wind and the solar output. So if you go to the next slide. Okay, so this gets a little bit confusing, but this again is that same data. And I had that data in the last chart based on percentage output. But recall, there's a significant growth in solar over the next few years. And so if we assume that same range of output from, I said 50% up to 90%, remember I said that for solar, it ranges from 50% up to 90%. This year, we have about 7,500 megawatts of solar online. And so 50% of that would be a little less than 4,000 megawatts. And 90% of that would be somewhere around 7,000 megawatts. And that's what the solid yellow line is. It's taking those percentages and applying it to the amount of solar. So that if we have the exact same percentage output of solar resources this summer as we've had in previous summers, you would expect to get this data out of the actual resources involved. And so then the dotted yellow line is if we have that same output from the solar we expect next summer. And you can really see how the growth in solar, if we have that same amount of variability, how that growth of solar is going to significantly change the output of solar on the grid. And then the solid green line is that distribution of wind for this year, and the dotted green line is the distribution of wind for next year. I hope that makes sense. And it's just trying to kind of lay the groundwork for the variability of these resources and some of the challenge that that brings. So now I'm going to go to the next slide. I want to highlight a little bit of how does solar and wind play together. And I took this chart off of the ERCOT website. You can look at this every day if you want to. And what this chart shows is the forecast for solar for the next day. And this is Sunday. I think this is Sunday, June 25th, if I've got my dates right. So what you see on this is there's kind of an orange, burnt orange line, and that's the day ahead forecast for solar. And then the blue line is the current, most recent up-to-date forecast for solar resources. And I think I pulled this about 8 or 9 in the morning. If you look really, really carefully, get really, really close, there's actually a green line. In addition, there's a green line, which probably is right underneath the blue line. And the green line is the actual output of solar. But you can go to the ERCOT website. If you look under grid conditions, and there's a page where this chart is available 24/7. A couple things I want to highlight. Obviously, you can see the significant ramp in the morning up and the significant ramp down at night. So obviously, this is very different from wind. Wind, I've got a chart in a minute that will show kind of similar for wind. Wind is different almost every day. It's got a different characteristic depending on what the front is coming through, et cetera. Solar is going to show up at a certain time in the day, and it's going to go away in the evening. The other thing I wanted to highlight here is this is the first time I've seen our forecast go over 7,000 megawatts for solar. We're getting solar development every day. We've got new resources coming online. So these numbers keep on creeping up. If you had looked at this chart last year, they would have been down in the 2,000 to 3,000 range. So, this is really showing that growth. I want to highlight before we leave this slide, if you look from about 1800, so our 6 o'clock to 2100, so that would be 9 o'clock. The solar output drops from about 6,000 megawatts to 0 megawatts. So that's kind of that ramp down late evening. So if you go to the next slide, we're going to see that same day. This is wind. This is what wind was doing on that same day. This is a very typical shape for summer for wind. We see it start off at a high level and come down during the mid-afternoon and then increase in the evening. What I want to highlight here is if you look at that same period from about 2 p.m. to about 9 p.m., you see a growth in wind of about 5,000 megawatts. So at the same time the solar is ramping down, the wind is ramping up. So this is a really interesting phenomenon here in ERCOT that we see very often. We see the wind ramping up in the late afternoon, just as the solar is ramping down. And that's one of the reasons that we have not experienced this duck curve like you see in California, where there's so much solar that they actually get their peak demand, their actual scarcity conditions late in the afternoon, is actually in the early evening when the sun goes down, because of the complementary nature of wind and solar. The other reason we don't see the duck curve quite yet is because Texas is very wide. California is very narrow. So California, they've got these solar resources that are all kind of seeing the same sun across the span of the day. In Texas, we've got about 700 miles of geography. So what we see is way out in West Texas, where we've got a significant amount of solar resources, they're still seeing sun when we're getting peak demands in Houston and in Dallas.
Mhm.
Okay, so next slide. The next two slides get a little bit complicated, but I'm still trying to tease out this, how are wind and solar going to play together on the grid? And so we kind of looked at it from a time perspective, but now what I want to look at is, again, looking at those top 20 demand hours. So I'm really just focused in on the hours in which consumer demand is at its peak. Those are the hours where we are likely to have some concerns over having enough resources. And what I did was, on the x-axis, I charted the amount of solar in each of those 60 hours. So we're looking at the top 20 demand hours for the past 3 summers. So there's 60 points on the page here. And if you look at the amount of solar is the x-axis, the amount of solar percentage output, and then the amount of wind output is the y-axis. And so now you think about it, the days when solar is likely to be low, we're likely to be getting clouds through, maybe a front coming through. Well, if a front is coming through, then typically wind resources are going to be at higher than expected. And that's what this chart kind of shows, because if you look at the hours in which solar output is low, so that's towards the left-hand side of this graph, you look kind of at the 60% point, there's about 6 points there where solar is at 60% or lower than 60%. You can see that. There's those 6 dots, and 5 of those dots are the wind is above 25%, which is the amount that we count the wind at. So what we're not seeing in this chart here is a lot of dots where the wind is really low and solar is really low. I hope that makes sense. So that would be the concern. And I also added a trend line, and the trend line tends to indicate, this is very limited data, that when the solar is low, the wind is actually higher. There's a bit of a trend there. So if you go to the next chart, I take this one step further. And what I've done here is so I apologize. I love my charts. It's the exact same 60 points, just as I explained it a minute ago, except I've actually got 61 points because I've got a mark on my, I just realized I've got a mark on my monitor here that looks like a data point. Again, it's the exact same 60 points, but now what I've done is I've sorted the 60 points based on which ones are really the highest in each year. And the highest ones in each year, I've highlighted in red. So the red points are the top 5 customer demand hours from each of the 3 years. So there's 15 red dots. The yellow dots are the middle 10 data points from each year. And then the green dots are the lowest 5. So still, these are the top 20 customer demand hours, but the red dots then are the highest of the top 20 demand hours. And what you can see is none of the low solar hours, obviously we're still talking about the top 20 customer demand hours, but none of the low solar hours are in that red category. And as a matter of fact, many of the red dots are showing solar output above 80%. So that, obviously we've got limited data, and that's something of a concern, limited operational data. We've got a lot of modeling capability to look at kind of historical data and what would solar and wind be like if we had the same weather conditions that we've had in the past. But none of that is really a substitute for operational data. So going forward, hopefully we're going to be able to expand some of this out and see some of these rarer weather events and what the implications are. So that's kind of looking at how wind and solar are going to play together. If we go to the next slide, and this is really the last slide that I'm going to talk about, and then we'll have time for questions. Oh, wait. Let's go one more. Click I forgot I've got an animation here. Okay, stop. So this actually gives you the this actually gives you the amount of wind and solar output at those percentages for 2021 and 2022. So given the amount of wind and solar we have on the grid for 2021, and given the amount of wind and solar that we expect in 2022. And as you can see, there still is a range. That upper red dot there for 2021, if those exact same conditions were to occur again this summer, we would have over 20,000 megawatts of wind and solar output. Whereas that lower left-hand corner, only 11,500 megawatts of wind and solar outputs. That kind of, again, shows you this variability, and that variability increases to 33,000 and 19,000 going forward. So it's that variability that does represent a challenge to the grid. Okay, so now we can go to the next slide. And this is the last slide that I want to talk about. And I really want to kind of take these grid challenges and bring them back to what I think is going to be the real challenge going forward, which is all of these new options that consumers have. And so I want to highlight two things first, though. The first thing I want to highlight is, and this gets really kind of complicated, but the complexity of how we do things today. And, so just as an example of this, we have these complex computer models that actually implement the energy-only market here in the ERCOT region. And so this is, all of the generation owners submit bids, and every 5 minutes, this really complex model runs, and it takes into account all of the limitations of the transmission system and all of the limitations of the generation units, and it calculates what's the lowest cost sources of energy for the next 5 minutes. And it sends out a dispatch signal to all of the different generation units that are online, the transmission system. And then it does the exact same thing 5 minutes later. And it goes every 5 minutes, every hour of the day, 24/7. This is an incredibly complex set of computer systems that run this market. We are currently in the process of upgrading some of these computer systems. And the schedule to complete these upgrades is sometime in 2024. So it takes around 4 years to upgrade the systems and then test the systems. And so that just kind of shows you the complexity of the systems. Takes 4 years. Now, at the same time, these systems reflect rules that are incorporated into our protocols, our market protocols, and in regulatory requirements, the regulatory statutes at the Public Utility Commission. And these can take years to change. And so in all of these systems, there are years and years of work that goes on to making changes to this complex market that we have and ensuring that this market is going to continue to operate reliably. So it's really that complexity of the market that I think is really important to keep in mind as we start talking about the rate at which some of these new technologies are being built and being brought to the system. So the other thing I wanted to highlight was transmission development. We build these generation units, the investors build these generation units across the system, and there's just a limited amount of transmission. And so in many cases, there's a need to upgrade the transmission system, to build more transmission lines. And it takes about 5 years to build transmission, to plan and build transmission. Also, it's becoming increasingly difficult to get right-of-way for transmission lines. So that's a significant barrier going forward. And also, transmission is incredibly expensive. So you don't want to build it unless you really know that it's necessary. So in the context of taking 4 or 5 years to change kind of market design and market rules and market systems, taking 4 or 5 years to build transmission to maintain reliability of the transmission system, now we've got solar units on the transmission system that can be built in 6 months. You remember I said that some of those units that are 2 or 3 years away are still speculative because even though they've got contracts for service, they haven't started construction yet. Well, it's because it only takes 6 to 9 months to build some of these solar facilities. So that's some of this rate of change, and battery facilities are the same way. And now increasingly, we're seeing more and more interest for change and consumer options down on the distribution system. So, building rooftop solar and, putting batteries in in houses and putting batteries in businesses and industries, et cetera. There has always been a certain amount of generation at some of our larger commercial facilities, but now smaller and smaller commercial facilities are putting in gas turbines, putting in solar, putting in batteries, et cetera. And this is really changing the nature of the grid. Admittedly, the reliability challenges that we see just make some of these consumer options more attractive going forward. So really, one of the challenges that I see going forward is the fact that, the wholesale market is so well developed. We know exactly what the prices are all across the system, all across the day. But you get down onto the consumer network, down onto the distribution network at the consumer level, and the first thing you have to figure out is, well, what's the value of a kilowatt hour? And to some extent, some people think the value of a kilowatt hour that's being provided by one party is different than the value being provided by another party. And, I think that's a valid conversation to be having, but I think it's really important to note that, in many cases, it's difficult even to know what the value of new generation, like a new solar, if a homeowner is putting some of the output of their solar panels onto the distribution network, what's the value of that? Increasingly, though, we're not just going to be talking about the value of generation of kilowatts. We're going to be talking about the value of flexibility. So if someone has, if someone has a battery, a power wall in their house, or, increasingly, if they have an electric vehicle and they're willing to charge their electric vehicle when prices on the grid are very low, what's the value of that? Obviously, they get to take advantage of lower prices, but maybe that can be aggregated up and that can actually be provided as a service onto the grid to increase the reliability of the system. But if we can't even figure out what the value of putting a kilowatt hour onto the grid is, it's another step altogether to figure out, well, what's the value of a consumer having some flexibility, being able to participate in some way in the market. So, I think this is going to be a real challenge going forward. And unfortunately, where we are today, we talked about the amount of time it takes to change grid systems. And, there's a lot of discussion right now about the wholesale energy market and changing the wholesale energy market. To some extent, a lot of that conversation doesn't include these consumer options and the changing consumer options that are out there. And, honestly, technology isn't going to slow down. The technology is coming and it's here today. So, I really think what I want to leave you with is the challenge that I see going forward is the challenge from consumers taking more of a role on the grid and understanding what the value of that is and understanding how to incorporate that into our planning and into our operations so that it can be a component of, and we can maintain the reliability of the grid. So that's really what I wanted to kind of bring to your attention. I'm really happy to take questions.
And I think we have lots.
Okay, good.
I think we have a series of questions, but Warren, we really enjoyed all the different extrapolations of data. You made it simple for us to understand. I think one right off from the top of my head before we dive into the other questions as well is when we look at the larger scheme of energy generation from ERCOT, what percentage would you say is wind and solar? Like, what slice of the pie were we looking at in this presentation compared to the full picture of gas and coal that is currently generated?
Yeah, I believe, we've got charts, all sorts of charts on the website. I believe the output of wind and solar right now is about 20% across the year. So about 20% of our energy is coming from wind and solar resources. And again, currently we've got about 31,000 megawatts of wind. We've got about 7,500 megawatts of solar. Well, we've got, I believe we've got about 15,000 megawatts of coal on the grid. We've got about 5,000 megawatts, probably a little bit more than that, of nuclear. We have 2 nuclear plants here in ERCOT. We've got about 55,000 megawatts of gas on the system, I believe. And we've got 500 megawatts of hydro. which we don't get a whole lot of energy out of our hydro resources. It's mainly when they're moving water from one impoundment to another, they generate some electricity.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's good just to understand like what is needed to accomplishing 100% renewable future, right? Would be to displace those, right?
Well, there are an enormous number of operational challenges between where we are today and a 100% renewable output future. And some of those challenges we understand today, some of those challenges we are learning, and it gets very complex when we start talking about moving alternating current power over hundreds of miles, from Amarillo down to Brownsville. I mean, that's kind of the span of our grid right now. Our kind of the ERCOT market overall is it's a deregulated wholesale energy market, and so investors bring their resources to the system. And the focus of planning and operations right now is to understand where we are today and where we're going, and understand what's needed to maintain reliability with the amount of resources that the investors are bringing in the different types of what those resources are.
Okay. So that helps me. And now I need to digest a little bit of the questions, just being conscientious of time and knowing that we only have 10 minutes. But I'll ask kind of the first one, which was a little bit technical, but asking if you find where there is elevated voltage in the distribution with high solar penetration, what do you think about using capacitor banks that are offline or other actions that can be taken at the substation? Meaning like autonomous inverters with ancillary services, or just any uses of technology. That's
yeah, it's a complicated issue. So admittedly, the resources that are on the transmission system, so in the transmission substations, et cetera, those resources typically are not used in order to alter the conditions on the distribution network. The distribution guys kind of handle operations on the distribution networks, and the transmission operators handle it on the transmission system. Increasingly, though, we need to be communicating between the two groups. I would also note that the grid requirements for resources that are put on the distribution network are different from the grid requirements on the transmission network. If you build a solar array on the transmission network, we have a laundry list of requirements associated with reactive control and with ramping capability. That's why I talked about, we've got all those units that are still doing their testing. Well, they have to pass a whole array of tests to show us that they can operate and they can help us maintain the reliability of the grid. The rules for resources on the distribution network are different. To some extent, they are laxer. To some extent, they are very focused on maintaining worker safety. So if there's an outage and workers have to go in and work on the distribution network, the requirements are set up so that the distributed generation resources will not impair their safety. But going forward, those requirements are getting stricter as we see more and more distributed resources on the grid.
Okay. And that's important to highlight, about the safety. I think that when we're talking about the kilovolts, the amount of voltage that is handled at those levels, that it can be a risky situation for any worker.
Well, yeah, at 240 volts will set you back a notch.
Just the time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and then there's a series of questions a little bit about the calculations about reserve margins. If the reserve margins are focused more on calculating in the summer peaks, and what has been done kind of on the winter peaks, and if there's any focus on spring or fall, also considering those variabilities in weather. Sure.
Obviously, when we do our seasonal assessments, we look at each season individually as the year goes on. If you look at the capacity demand reserves report and the reserve margin, there's some information that's in my slide deck that talks about a study that we do, an offline study that we do, that equates different reserve margins to reliability expectations across the entire year. And so that study looks at all 87, 60 hours of the year, and it looks at 30 different weather years. So it goes back 30 different weather years in history. And that study looks at different reserve margins, what the expectation would be for reliability across the year. It also looks at some things. There's some charts on the deck that I didn't want to get to here because of limited time, but it looks at kind of, well, how will batteries play in this when we get more batteries on the system? What if we have more solar than we're currently expecting? So it runs some scenarios like that. It's an interesting read, but suffice it to say that that study indicated that kind of the traditional reliability criteria of having one loss of load event every 10 years, which is kind of, an industry standard that goes back decades, that one loss of load event every 10 years is equivalent in today's ERCOT market of having a reserve margin of 15.75%. And I said earlier on that our current reserve margin is 15.7%. So exactly where we are today, we're just at that point where we're kind of hitting that industry standard of one event in 10 years. That would be the expectation.
Okay.
And that's, again, looking across the whole year.
Yeah, it's 15 and then it'll increase up into 30 in a couple of years too, right?
Yeah. And I should note, so our market, we have a deregulated energy only market, which means that power plants only get paid when they produce energy. And so, that market is really currently is designed to support about a 12.5% reserve margin. So it's a very lean market design. And obviously the Public Utility Commission is talking about adjusting that market design so that, this is something that's under discussion, but the way the market is designed today, it's calculated to support about a 12.5% reserve margin. So you see these reserve margins out into the future, and the expectation has to be that either we're going to continue to see delays in some of this development, or we could see retirement of some of the older gas or coal generation that's on the grid still, like we did 3 years ago.
Mm-hmm. And that's kind of what helped push the adoption for greater solar, right? Was just like this natural reduction of or just extinction of those plants, right?
Yeah, it is a cycle. We have a cyclical market where we see development of new resources and then retirement of older, not competitive resources, and then a development of new resources going forward. So, I mean, that's the cycle that we've seen here in ERCOT for about the last 20 years, different technologies.
And right now it's just mostly focused on developing more wind and solar and storage resources, or just solar and some storage?
I would say the real focus right now is solar. And increasingly, the focus will be storage. Although I think storage still has to figure out its niche in our market, figure out if it's kind of got a place in the market. I think a lot of the facilities that are being built today are, expecting to participate in a part of the market, some of these reliability services, but then, going to explore whether or not they've got other revenue sources in the market.
Okay. Yeah, and I guess to that point, there were a couple of questions that dealt with exactly with that, of using decentralized storage, and as a way, perhaps like with virtual power plants, and as a way to kind of promote the resiliency on it. Do you see that as it's not really your focus, but do you see that as being beneficial to manage those reserves? Yeah,
I think increasingly we're going to see. Because of the variability of wind and the prevalence of solar on the system, we're going to see periods where resources are very prevalent and power prices are very low. And I think storage is going to be able to help us both with kind of evening that out, but also take advantage of those low prices and take in that power when it's available and cheap. And I really think electric vehicles is going to be a part of that. I think to the extent that we have, and not just cars, but increasingly vans and trucks and buses in kind of electric fleets that when they plug into the system, they're going to be able to operate as these distributed resources.
Mm-hmm. And to your earlier point, where the big challenge is also finding out how to compensate for that, how to measure the cost at different times of that energy that goes in or goes out. So that's quite well to understand. And I think that the other questions can kind of get a little bit more into the nitty-gritty of the February events. You know, if there's plans about weatherizing technology, or if there's plans, you know, about encouraging the output of solar across different regions of Texas, you know, the Southeast or the Southwest. Do you guys really have a say, perhaps, on the technology that gets used to develop it?
Yeah, we actually do not. We are in a role of facilitating the connection of resources that are brought by investors to the grid. So our role is making sure people, investors, get a reliable connection for their new resources to the grid, but we don't control what they build or where they build. But I would note that today, a lot of our solar resources are out in West Texas. But I mentioned before how long it takes to build transmission, because of the fact that a lot of the transmission assets that were built primarily for wind as part of the competitive renewable energy zone project, a lot of those transmission facilities are now fully utilized. And as a result of that, we're seeing increased congestion between West and East Texas. And so there's a lot of interest today in building solar in East Texas. As a matter of fact, I live in Flugerville right here, and just about 5 miles that away towards the east, there's a brand new solar facility called Flugerville Solar that I got to watch them build. That's how I know that it takes around 6 months to build them, because I watched them build it. It was fascinating. But you know, they're being built, but solar facilities are being built all over the place. There's a number of facilities scheduled to come online down in Wharton County, which is just outside of Houston. So, you know, it'll be fascinating as we go into the next few years, how these solar facilities just pop up all over the grid, which will be good for diversity, because then we'll be getting a more spread solar pattern across the hours of the day. We'll get a little bit more in the morning, and then in the evening we'll still have some of our resources way out in West Texas.
Which would be nice, and that kind of reminds me a little bit that we'll be updating our website soon to share some of like the different ways in which the average consumer can be part of those solar projects, you know, whether it is community solar, whether it's rooftop solar, or just choosing to have 100% renewable energy come through Austin Energy. So stay on the lookout for that. But I want to be conscientious of time. Thank you for the different colors. Thank you for the helping us understand the numbers and realizing that, you know, it's very challenging when you are projecting forward and how quickly, you know, 2021 was also a great year, because it was a year in which like the solar reserves were higher than the wind reserves. You know, I think that's a pretty big achievement for industry. You know, and seeing how much we're going to continue ramping up. So that's a good piece of information, as well as knowing that, you know, from your team, to mention the point of diversity and inclusion, you know, that you have so many women leaders out there that are strong lawyers, and as you mentioned earlier, the cream of the crop, you know. So it's important for the students that are out there, you know, that are looking for opportunities in energy, to also consider ERCOT as another way to participate. But Warren, I really appreciate the time, the knowledge. You know, you've removed the curtain about like what it is that goes out there, the high voltage levels. Which we don't imagine. But thank you so much, and everyone else, thank you for tuning in. Hope you guys had a happy hour on a Tuesday, and for some of you, I know you have to enjoy your tacos tonight. So enjoy your Taco Tuesday, and I'll see you next month.
Thank you.